Thank you very much, Ahmed. And as he mentioned, I do live in Ankara now, so this is the shortest lecture trip of my life, although it's also my first time setting foot on the Bilkent campus, so I'm very pleased to be here. I'll be talking about Marshall McLuhan, who I think most of you have some familiarity with, the great Canadian media theorist who lived from 1911 to 1980. And even though I'm a philosopher, I've been working quite a lot on McLuhan, who usually isn't touched by philosophers. I've been working on him for about 20 years, and I was counting this morning, I've written 9 articles or book chapters about him, which was a lot more than I thought. So it's about time to write a book about him, I think. The only people I've written about more are Heidegger and Bruno Latour, and I've written books about both of those figures. Now, I think it's fair to say that McLuhan is respected, but he's not universally respected. And this is why I call the lecture Taking McLuhan Seriously. Because the name obviously is very well known to everybody, but he's viewed in many circles as a sort of trendy television pundit. And he was big in the 1960s, not only a television expert in the 1960s, but a television star in the 1960s. If you go on YouTube, you can see all kinds of television talk show appearances by McLuhan. This was deeply resented by his colleagues at the University of Toronto. I've gotten to know his son Eric somewhat, and the number of hateful things that were said to his father by colleagues in the English department is quite remarkable. There was some jealousy there probably. But they didn't like the fact that he was an international media star. And he resurfaces, of course, from time to time. Anytime a new medium arises. So when the internet was first getting big in the early 90s, we saw a lot of McLuhan again. Maybe again with smartphones a few years ago, I had more McLuhan. And anytime there's a big mini revolution in media, you'll hear his name again. But he kind of comes and goes, in and out of fashion. And actually, he'd have something to say about that. He was the philosopher who told us the most about how things go in and out of fashion, I think. And I'll get to that a bit later. I happen to think he's extremely important. I also would link him with a couple of the other more prominent figures in the humanities in the 20th century. McLuhan is one of the major figures in media theory. We also have Martin Heidegger in philosophy, who I think has many points in common with McLuhan. And in the arts, Clement Greenberg, who also went way out of fashion in the late 1960s because of where the arts went, but is starting to come back slowly, simply because of the breadth and intensity of his work. I also see some strong points of contact between McLuhan and Clement Greenberg. That will all come out in tonight's talk. And I've been asked to go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. All right. How would we boil down all of McLuhan's work to a couple of insights? I would choose 2, if I had to. First of all, there's the famous phrase, the medium is the message, which you can summarize by saying that for McLuhan, the content of a medium is never as important as the medium itself. So the difference between good and bad television shows is fairly trivial when you look at the structure of television itself and how television, merely the fact that it's television and not radio, affects our perception. Good or bad television doesn't really make much of a difference. Print medium. I just saw him give a lecture today on YouTube about this from the 70s. He thinks the content of any book, however controversial in the history of printed books, is fairly trivial compared with the fact of Gutenberg's revolution itself, the printing press. What that did in terms of democratization, making books available to a large number of people. In short, it's the hidden conditions, the hidden background conditions of a medium that are important for McLuhan. It's not the content of the medium itself. We're usually focused on the content as critics. We're focused on praising the good content or criticizing the bad content of a given genre or medium, but in fact it's the medium itself that is most important. He even goes so far as to say that the content of any medium is about as important as the graffiti on the casing of an atomic bomb. It's not important at all. The bomb explodes and the graffiti gets vaporized. That's one insight. If I had to pick a second, I think it would probably be the difference between hot and cold media, which I think he doesn't work out consistently. But this is another of his main ideas. It gets criticized a lot. Hot medium is one that presents a lot of information to you, so there's not as much information processing that you need to perform. Everything's already there for you. Whereas cold media tend to be more hypnotic. They tend to provide less information. You have to provide a lot of the context yourself. And his classic example is the difference, of course, between radio and television. Radio he sees as a hot medium because the words are being fired at you. You listen to the words. There's not much room for participation for you as a listener. With television, on the other hand, he sees that as a cold medium because the images are vague and flickering, at least in his time they were. I don't know if he changed his mind now. You only see a very small visual space compared to what you normally see, and so you have to provide a lot of the information yourself. And so you become more involved somehow, and it does have a more hypnotic effect. And he has a couple of case studies, a couple of examples he gives of this to explain the difference. One of them, interesting idea, he says that Hitler could never have risen to power in the television era. And I think that I can see the points. There's something to be said for that. That Hitler it's not just a matter of being, sort of ugly looking on television. It's also that he was a screamer, and this works on radio, inflaming crowds and making people angry. If you imagine someone screaming like Hitler on a television set, it would look somehow ridiculous. Okay? It would look clownish. That's McLuhan's claim anyway. I can see the point of that. Another example, more relevant to the United States, is the famous first television debate in the presidential campaign between Kennedy and Nixon in 1960. This was often seen as the turning point of the election, a very close election in Kennedy's favor. And it's the usual thing that's said in America is that Kennedy won this because of the television debate. Kennedy is much more presentable, he's very handsome, he comes across as a cooler personality on television. Nixon had a kind of stubbly beard, he was sweating and didn't look good on television. And we hear this from the time we're kids in the US, and okay, I wasn't alive then, but that's what we're told. What McLuhan claims, though, and I don't have independent verification of this, is that Nixon actually won the debate among radio listeners. The radio listeners actually chose Nixon as the winner of the debate because maybe his arguments were somehow more cogent, whereas Kennedy just played the cool character and spoke in shorter sentences perhaps and looked better, and so he was a better fit for television, being a cold medium. That's just one example of the difference between a hot and a cold medium for McLuhan. There's a big problem with this that I'm going to point out later. I was going to point to another cold medium paradoxically, which is fire. Fire is hot, right? In terms of media, it's cold because it's just flickering. Any medium that's very hypnotic, that you can participate with for hours at a time, is probably a cold medium, because it means that you're investing a lot of your mental energy in constructing the situation and making sense of it. I would say video games are a cold medium, whereas I would tend to say, I don't know what McLuhan said about film, I've forgotten, but I would say film is probably a hot medium because you don't choose the views for yourself. The view in each scene is presented for you directly. You don't provide the information. The filmmaker is providing all the information for you. Whereas in a video game, you explore the terrain. There's a certain number of entities in the game. There are bombs and gifts and guns and helicopters, and you learn the rules for using each of these things. But you have to provide the storyline in the video game. You have to walk around and do things for yourself. And video games are extremely hypnotic. Famously so, you can play them for 20, 30 hours at a time, and people in Korea die of heart attacks from playing them for too long. The fire. I thought of this first because when my 2-month-old nephew came to visit for the first time, my parents had a fireplace going, and he sat there staring at it for, must have been over an hour, without blinking. What was so hypnotic about that fire? He wouldn't have been able to do that with anything else. My brother said he's saying, "How may I serve thee, master?" He was so engrossed in the fire. So fire, in a way, is the ultimate example, because there's absolutely no information there at all. Just this kind of gentle, caressing flickering that you have to daydream about. All right, and I think so again, I'd say that the two central points of McLuhan, maybe the medium is the message, what's important is the background structure of a medium and not the content of it, and then the difference between hot and cold media, high definition and low definition media. I think most of his other insights follow from these two. For example, the idea that we're all being re-tribalized in a global village, that the literate print era of modern history is coming to an end, and we're all merging together in electronic mass media and rock concerts and things of this sort. All of these things follow, I think, from his two central ideas. The medium is the message, and the difference between hot and cold media. And of course, he also thinks that these electronic media are extensions of our central nervous system, and so this increases group participation, but also increases paranoia, because now you have to worry about horrible stuff that happens on the other side of the world in a way that you might not have had to worry about it in 1970. You want to watch some hideous scene playing out in Syria. Well, that's not a good example because you're next door to Syria. But for me, Syria was always far away growing up. You can watch this on YouTube, some horrible battlefield scene. So there's this kind of imminence of all these terrible things that are happening around the world. Everything's happening in proximity to us. All right. So anyway, this was spelled out in McLuhan's classic of the early 1960s, Understanding Media, which went out of print then, strangely, for many years, came back into print in the early 90s. But then in the 1970s, something interesting happened, which is that McLuhan was asked to prepare a second edition of Understanding Media. And he had filed away all the complaint letters he'd gotten about the first book in a folder, and he decided he was going to answer these, and people were saying things like, there were factual criticisms, of course, like you got the year wrong on that technology or something. Then there was the criticism that the book isn't scientific. You're just making blanket proclamations about media. There's no science to it. And so he started asking himself, what is a scientific statement? What is it that makes a statement scientific? And he spent a couple of years doing this. And he decided on Popper's definition that a scientific statement is what is falsifiable. That if you can imagine an experience, an experiment that would lead you to abandon a thesis, then it's a scientific thesis. Whereas if there's no possible circumstance under which that could happen. It's not scientific. And of course, Popper didn't like things like Marxism and psychoanalysis because he thought there was no possible experience that could falsify it. Right? In psychoanalysis, if you leave, if somebody gives you a gift and you break the gift, this could mean anything. This could mean you don't like the person and so you didn't want the gift secretly, unconsciously. It could mean that you love the person and you want an excuse for them to give you another gift. It could mean, there are multiple meanings that this could have. And so this is the very quintessence of unscientific pseudoscience for Popper. Anyway, Popper has been attacked for a number of reasons, but that's the inspiration guided McLuhan in the second edition of Understanding Media. And he and his son worked on these throughout the 70s, and very quickly they came up with what they thought were the 4 laws of all media, 4 laws that apply to all media, by which they mean all human constructions, anything human, not just communications media, but anything that humans make. And I'm going to put them on the board because I'm going to talk a bit about these. Put them in a diagrammatic fourfold structure. Any medium enhances something, it empowers something. So an obvious example, cars enhance speed and the ability to live far away from your job and the ability to carry loads from place to place, all kinds of things that cars do for us. And they obsolescence, the horse and buggy, mass transit and trains, trolleys perhaps in some cities. Any medium will do both of those things. It will enhance something while cutting off something else. And these are the 2 obvious ones. This is Understanding Media was all about this. Then he came up with 2 others. And one of them is reversal. And this is the overheating of a medium. And again, cars would be a good simple example. What happens when you get too many cars? Then you get Seattle, or I guess even Istanbul now, where the traffic is so bad it becomes an inconvenience. You don't want the car. You get stuck in these horrible traffic jams, you lose your freedom because you're tied down to insurance payments and paying for monthly parking spaces and everything else you have to do when you own a car. At a certain point, it just becomes more trouble than it's worth, and that's a simple example of a reversal. And then there's retrieval, the 4th one, which from McLuhan means that any new medium has an old medium as its content. It's bringing back some old medium that people thought was dead, but it brings it back. And one example of this will be that the car brings back the knight in shining armor, right? Because people get in stupid duels in their cars. They decorate their cars the way knights used to decorate their horses with bumper stickers and things hanging from the mirror and that kind of thing. He's quite convinced that everything brings back some old medium. There's a very funny article a few years ago in the American comedy newspaper, The Onion. I don't know how well known that is here, The Onion. And it was, I think McLuhan would have loved it. It was about lava lamps. And the story was something like lava lamps reverse from passe retro kitsch into novel retro camp again for the 5th time in a decade. Lava lamps, you never know exactly where they are. Are lava lamps cool, or are they out of fashion again? Are they back in fashion? That's probably the best example. Something that keeps flickering back and forth from corny to cool faster than any other medium. But if you think about it, you would say that the CD obsolesced vinyl records for a while, except among the real enthusiasts. And then the vinyl records came back because people missed the warm sound. Or you could put it a different way. You could say that cassette tapes for a while in the 70s were obsolescing vinyl LPs. And in a sense, the CDs were retrieving the vinyl LP against the cassette tape. So there's a couple of different ways you can analyze any given situation. Now, Eric McLuhan, I should say that they never finished this book during Marshall McLuhan's lifetime. Marshall McLuhan was working on the systematic book on these, it's called the tetrad, and the Greek word for 4. All human innovations have this fourfold structure according to them, no exceptions. They were working on the systematic treatment of this, which would have been effectively the second edition of Understanding Media. It would have been a new book. Marshall McLuhan, unfortunately, had his stroke in 1979, could no longer work, and died on the last day of 1980, December 31st, 1980, and then left his son Marshall to finally put out a kind of skeletal version of this project in the early 1990s, I think it was 92, under the title of Laws of Media, the New Science. And he says in the preface, our tetrad is undoubtedly the most important intellectual discovery of at least the past few centuries. And there are 2 things you can do about that. So authors sometimes do this. Alain Badiou, if you know Alain Badiou in philosophy, writes the beginning of the preface to the English version of his major book, Being an Event. He said, "When I first finished this book in 1988, I immediately knew I had written a great work of philosophy." You can read that either as just tasteless arrogance, or you can read it as I read it, which is, it's a wonderful risk, because somebody like Badiou or the McLuhans have something to lose. It's not like these are just people on the internet bragging emptily about the greatest thinker of the past few centuries. These are people who are going to look stupid if they can't deliver on that. So they're at least taking a risk by saying, I've created the greatest intellectual discovery of the past few centuries. So is it? I don't know about that, but it at least makes me want to take it seriously. What would it take for us to agree that this is the greatest theory of the last few centuries in any human science? Probably we would have to come to the realization that something here is being revealed that was completely missed by all past theories in the humanities. And what would that be? It has to be some variation of the theme of the medium as the message. Because this is ultimately what McLuhan is about. The idea that what's hidden in the background is most important. The surface content is not important, whereas most Western thought from McLuhan has been focused on the surface. It's been focused on dialectic as opposed to rhetoric, which is ancient controversy. And of course, philosophers usually were supporting dialectic against the rhetoricians. The rhetoricians were sophists who were trying to manipulate people. McLuhan really takes the other side. Actually puts rhetoric and grammar together. You go back to the early McLuhan, he's quite fascinated with these classical disciplines. Trivium, rhetoric and grammar, he poses both of these dialectic. Dialectic is when you prove something. It's when you state something in clear propositional terms. This is what we usually think thinking is. Right? It's about stating our argument as clearly as we can, and this is what philosophers are supposed to do, this is what any clear thinker is supposed to do. Whereas we tend to see rhetoricians now as mere rhetoricians. They're just getting in front of a crowd and manipulating them to start wars and things of this sort. But rhetoric classically was a lot more than that, of course. Rhetoric classically was about backgrounds. It was about, if you read Aristotle's rhetoric, Aristotle taught rhetoric to his students half the day. He only taught philosophy the other half. And that's not because we live in this horrible, corrupt world that his students have to survive in. It's because he saw this as important. Unlike Plato. Plato, that's a contradiction. Plato's one of the greatest rhetoricians in Western philosophy and literature. But Aristotle actually came out and said, rhetoric is important. Why? Most language is rhetorical. Most language is what he calls an enemy. You're presupposing things without saying them. His favorite example. If you're in ancient Greece and you say this man has been crowned 3 times with laurel, you don't have to say because he won the Olympics, and when you win the Olympics in ancient Greece, you get a laurel crown. No, because everybody in the Greek audience knows this, and most of our language is like this. If you were spelling out every presupposition in everything you say to become a boring person, you have to do this with children sometimes. We don't do it with adults. We don't spell out. I don't say Obama was president of the United States. He was elected in 2008 by such and such electoral votes. But obviously, you don't do that. It becomes a burden. You have to simplify. You have to leave things presupposed. And I'm going to talk about a couple of other thinkers who do a lot of this idea as well. But I think it's important because I think a lot of our cognitive functioning takes place at this level. In the arts, this is obvious. Who would try to paraphrase an artwork, whether literature or visual arts, by replacing it with a description? You can give a description of an artwork, but you cannot exhaustively replace an artwork with a description. You cannot go into an art gallery, take all the art off the wall, and put tight prose descriptions on the wall of what artwork used to be here. You can do that as a deliberate Dadaist exercise, but you can't do this in the normal course of the arts. So there's something in the artwork that's there that's not translatable into propositional form, which is what makes it difficult to handle according to usual criteria. We've got, I like telling the example of Daniel Dennett's critique of wine criticism in his essay on Wine Inquiria, where he basically says we should fire all wine critics and replace them with a machine where you just pour the wine in the top and gives a chemical formula. Because he says wine critics are pretentious. They just give you stuff like flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina, which anybody can say that's pretentious. My answer to that is that pretension is the risk run by the humanities. You're not going to meet a pretentious biologist or a pretentious physicist. They have their other vices, perhaps, but they're not going to be pretentious. You are going to run the risk of pretension in the humanities because you're going to get statements that are approximate, that are simply approaching something that cannot be stated always in direct propositional terms, that is oblique, that is elusive. I don't see any kind of problem with this language. We do this, as I said, in rhetoric. We do this in jokes. You know, explain a joke and you ruin it. We do this in threats. I often think of the example of The Godfather, making you an offer you can't refuse, which will become much less threatening if he had said, if you don't do what I want, I'll cut off your horse's head and put it in your bed. That's a grotesque statement, but it's not as ominous as saying an offer you can't refuse. Leaving things unstated is always often much more powerful way of expressing ourselves. And so this is what McLuhan is primarily about. The idea that rhetoric deserves some attention over dialectic, where it's been the reverse in most of the history of Western thought. Now, someone else thinks this. And this person is in philosophy, and that person is Martin Heidegger. And what should I do? So this is an eraser. So let's talk a little bit about Heidegger, who I think is a great parallel from McLuhan. Unfortunately, another Heidegger political controversy is about to erupt. I was just reading that they're going to publish even worse notebooks from the war early next year, and we're going to have more Heidegger anti-Semitic notebooks coming out. So, prepare for those. Still a very important philosopher. Heidegger, of course, is the heir to Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. In 1901. And of course, Heidegger was considered the heir to Husserl, the crown prince of phenomenology, the one who was going to take his teacher's movement further forward. But he pulled a surprise. He reversed Husserl and says, what does phenomenology tell us to do? Well, it's a complicated movement, but you can simplify it by saying that phenomenology tells us not to invent any theories about hidden things to which we don't have direct access. For example, the sciences do this. Sciences invent theories about digestion. Right? What happens when I put food in my mouth? How does it get digested and processed for my body to use as nutrients? Well, the sciences tell us a lot about this. Of course, for Husserl, these are all these things science tells us about digestion are grounded in my immediate experience of eating, feeling full, feeling hungry, having a stomach ache. This comes first. Our lived experience, describing in very exact detail what it's like to be alive, and any scientific theories about the entities that cause this to happen are secondary to Husserl. So he's starting off at this level of description, describing very exactly what happens to us as we go about our everyday lives. Heidegger, earlier than people think, 1919, not just in Being and Time in 1927, in his first surviving lecture course in 1919, he challenges this. 29 years old, already coming up with his own new philosophy, saying that Husserl is actually wrong when you think about it. The experience of having something in front of our minds is actually a pretty rare experience. Whether it's by looking at something, by having a theory about something, that's relatively rare. Most of the time, what are we doing? We're relying on things. We're relying on the floor to keep us from falling to the center of the earth. We weren't thinking about it. We are relying on the oxygen in the room that we're breathing to keep us alive. We don't think about the oxygen unless we have an asthma attack or unless the air is polluted. Your bodily organs, unless you're having a health crisis, you're probably not thinking about your bodily organs. Your liver and kidneys and hearts and lungs are working fine. Unless your knowledge of English is still minimal, you're probably not struggling with my grammar. Right? English grammar is probably internalized to you by now, and you don't have to conjugate everything in your mind as you do with new languages, and so on. This is what the majority of our life is about. So it's about relying on things. Consciousness is a very minimal part for Heidegger. Now, this is often interpreted as meaning that practice comes before theory for Heidegger. And so Richard Rorty says that, good deal, John Dewey saw all this 30 years before Heidegger. No, because that's not what Heidegger is saying. Heidegger is not saying that practice comes before theory. He's saying that practice and theory are equally distortions of the things. If you sit on a chair, you're reducing that chair to an exaggerated caricature just as much as when you look at the chair or invent a theory about chairs, if there is a theory about chairs. But theory and practice both distort things in the world. Why? Because when you're sitting in a chair, you're not noticing the things a dog notices about the chair, the mosquito notices about the chair, you're not reacting to it the way a raindrop would when it hits the chair. All objects react to each other in different ways. Any human interaction with any object is going to be pretty minimal compared with all the possible interactions you can have with it. The thing is deeper than any relation you can have with it. This, to me, is Heidegger's chief insight. Granted, it's not universally, my book about him was controversial for this reason. Most people don't agree that's there in Heidegger, but I think it is there. And this isn't relevant to tonight, but I pushed that a step further and say objects do this to each other as well. When fire burns cotton, to use the old example from Islamic philosophy, fire is not exhausting the cotton either. And this is the human relation to cotton is just a special case of any relation to cotton. The human relation to the world is not something different ontologically in kind from the collision of two things. The inanimate collisions are relations just the same as the human perception or thought about something as a relation. And so both of these have to be seen as translations of some deeper underlying non-relational reality. But that's ontology. We don't have to get into that so much tonight. I just need to go as far as we go to spec into McLuhan's orbit. Anyway, you can see that for Heidegger, just as for McLuhan, there's an obvious similarity. Just they're both theorists of backgrounds. They both believe that Heidegger could say the medium is the message. Heidegger would say being is the message, not beings. Heidegger draws a distinction between being and beings, right? His major book, Being in Time, is about trying to raise again the question of the meaning of being, which he thinks has been forgotten. Why has it been forgotten, according to Heidegger? Because we have misinterpreted being as presence. We think being is something that can become accessible to us in some theory. We can say being is God, or we can say being is matter, or we can say being is mathematics, the mathematical. We can say being is forms, or primary substances, or whatever any power, whatever any individual philosopher has said throughout history. We can say that is what being is, according to them. Heidegger's point is simply that something in being is withdrawn behind any of those theories. The being is not fully theorizable. It's always going to exceed our theories. There's something dark about being, and it shows itself differently in different historical eras. And sometimes we just have to wait and see what happens, how being reveals itself differently. And so he and McLuhan would very much agree in the sense that the surface context of any history, of any philosophical theory, of any era is fairly trivial compared to the deep structures that lie below that. McLuhan even says somewhere that as soon as you talk about the medium, it's no longer the medium, it's something you're talking about. So I start saying, I am fully aware that smartphones are the medium of our time and they're conditioning my consciousness in new ways. Well, yes, that's an insight, but you're not exhausting the smartphone when you do that. You're only grasping the very superficial features of it. The smartphone will always affect us in ways we never quite conceptualize, and any other medium too. All right, so there's Heidegger added to the mix. I want to add Clement Greenberg to the mix now too. And Clement Greenberg, according to many people, the greatest art critic of all time. He's been very unpopular since the late 1960s simply because the kind of art he favored started to go out of fashion and many of his principles started going out of fashion. So Greenberg got to live through first being the dominant art critic in the world and then being a completely out of fashion hermit who nobody wanted to talk to in his New York apartment. Finally died in the early 1990s. And Greenberg, of course, is also very important for being the critic who oversaw the move of advanced art from Paris to New York right after the Second World War. New York was really a backwater in the arts up until 1947-48, let's say. Jackson Pollock and de Kooning and some others really put New York on the map, and Greenberg was the one who was there. And it's interesting to go back and read his criticism of the time. Even in the early 40s, he's complaining about how bad we are compared to Europe, and all of our art is junk compared to Europeans, and then suddenly he flips in the late 40s. He says, we're producing the best art in the world. Whatever the reasons for that, historically, Greenberg was the one who was there, was the one who theorized it. And what is Greenberg telling us about the way art should be going? You can do art any way you want, of course, but what if you want to do art that's at the cutting edge? Now, the situation now is probably a little more confusing. The situation, the models for Greenberg were Cézanne, Cubism, Matisse, Miro. He was following that revolution around the turn of the 20th century. These are the people he was trying to theorize, all the way up to Pollock, and a few people after Pollock who aren't as famous, like Olitsky and Nolan and these figures. What has been happening in the arts, according to Greenberg? Well, since the Renaissance, painting was illusionistic. It was three-dimensional. It was trying to give lifelike depictions of scenes that you could see with your eye. You know this history. What starts happening with Manet is it starts flattening out. The picture becomes flat. And Greenberg thinks this is a good thing. Greenberg thinks painting should not try to be an illusionistic art. Painting is on a flat canvas, and it should be comfortable with this fact, and it should do painting that reflects the flatness of its medium. Painting should not try to pretend that it's three-dimensional. Now, he hedges a bit. Sometimes he says, I'm not saying that's always true, because of course he likes Renaissance art. Who doesn't like Renaissance art? He's saying that for various reasons that's no longer plausible as a way of doing art. Probably one of the reasons is photography. A lot of the three-dimensional oil painting that was done as portraits, or done as something to keep a record visually of what something looks like. Once there's photography, you don't need to do that in painting. You don't need to make accurate, lifelike representations in painting, so painting became free. That's one reason. Another reason is it simply became too mechanistic a method. People were able to dash off paintings in an academic style. And academic arts is Greenberg's enemy. Academic art is when you don't innovate according to the medium. You simply innovate by choosing some new content in the medium. And who does this sound like? This sounds a lot like Marshall McLuhan. Greenberg gave a very important lecture in 1979 in Sydney, Australia, where he said, what do I mean by academic arts? academic art is art that takes its medium for granted. Right? And that's a very McLuhan sounding principle. It's art that is only focused on producing yet another work in a certain style without ever asking what are the proper conditions of the medium that dictate how a work of art should be done. So if you sit down and say, I'm going to write a novel, and you simply write off another formulaic novel the same way that 1,000 other people have done it before, you're going to write a kind of banal, pot boiler. If you want to write a really interesting novel, you're going to have to do something innovative. You're going to have to play with the conventions in some way, or show your awareness of the limitations of the benefits of the medium of the novel in some sense. The novel didn't always exist. It was born probably with Don Quixote, arguably, or maybe early, maybe in Tale of Genji. There's an argument. And it'll die at some point, just like every other art form dies at some point. So for Greenberg, what makes you a really high-quality artist, at least in the modern times, is showing some awareness of the conditions of your background medium. And the conditions of the background medium, in the case of painting, are the flat canvas. You're painting on a flat piece of stretched canvas. So the culmination of this for Greenberg, of course, is Cubism. Because Cubism does not try to depict three-dimensional objects in realistic fashion. It cuts those objects into planes and spreads them out over the canvas. This, Greenberg, was the high point of 20th century art. Cubism, the early Cubism of Picasso and Braque, and also synthetic Cubism, when they created collages, he thought was a creative way to stop it from becoming too flat by creating an illusion of a third dimension there, without going back to the old kinds of 3D painting. How would you fail? What kinds of artists tried and failed to innovate arts? He's pretty harsh about some pretty famous artists. First of all, Salvador Dali and surrealism. What's bad about Dali? He says Dali's an academic painter. That sounds surprising, right? Dali's this shocking guy who you probably couldn't believe painted these paintings when you first looked at them. When I was a kid, I used to laugh at them with my brother, seeing all these crazy things Dali was painting. For Greenberg, all he's doing is taking the old three-dimensional tradition of illusionistic oil painting since the Renaissance and painting, tall, skinny giraffes with flames coming off their back, and monsters walking into drawing rooms, and one of my favorite, the Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can also be used as a table. You know that one? The Ghost of Vermeer, the painter, and it's a really long leg, and there's a tray on it, the drinking of it. Or any Dali painting, the persistence of memory that nothing watches. For Greenberg, this is just academic arts, just trying to shock you with new contents without innovating at all. In fact, Greenberg admits Dali did this on purpose. Dali cannot innovate according to medium because Dali wants to shock you with the content. So in order to shock you with the content, he has to keep the form the same. What if Dali had done his paintings in a Cubist style? And so you had Dali's Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can also be used as a table with like all these strange triangles and circles over it. There's too much going on there, right? It's too busy. You're being asked to innovate according to content and innovate according to form. It's like in an experiment, you have to have one control, right? You can't have two variables. You have to have a control in your experiment. That's what he thinks Dali was doing. He had to deliberately keep the medium of 19th century oil painting in place, three-dimensional illusionistic depiction of objects, in order to change those objects and paint really crazy ones. What about Duchamp? He also calls Duchamp an academic artist, I think less justifiably so. He argues that art since the 1960s has been neo-Duchampian, maybe not, but I think he's wrong to call Duchamp an academic artist. Why? Because if academic art is taking your medium for granted, in a way that's exactly what Duchamp doesn't do, right? By putting a bicycle wheel in the gallery and saying it's art, or a urinal, or a wine bottle rack, he's asking you to question the medium of art and what can count as an artwork and what can't. And maybe this has gone on too long, right? This is still going on in art now. People are always trying to shock us with what can count as an artwork. A guy goes and destroys all of his personal possessions in a furnace for 1 hour, and that's an artwork. Or you know these things. Floating cow in a tank of formaldehyde. So in a way, we're repeating this gesture ad infinitum. It's not really academic art, though. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. Surrealism and Dada are usually put together as one. And I can see why. They both are kind of whimsical. They have a similar sense of humor. Some of the personalities, some of the same people were involved in both. But in a sense, they're the opposites when you think about it. When you think about it, surrealism was keeping the medium the same to change the contents, whereas Dada was using banal contents in order to question the medium. Just as I asked you to imagine a Dali Cubist painting, imagine Duchamp trying to do his ready-mades with complicated objects. So like instead of doing a bottle rack or a urinal, he brought in new solar-powered engine for converting bio-waste into fuel. It's some 75-piece machine. That would be confusing, right? You wouldn't really be able to accept that as a ready-made. In order for Duchamp's gestures to work, it needs to be something very simple. So you can just say, what? That's a urinal in an art gallery. It's a shock. I can't believe it. It has to be something very simple and immediate and obviously meaningless in order to challenge the meaning. Now there's one other example where he's very harsh, Greenberg, and this was in an obituary, believe it or not. This is right after Kandinsky died. Greenberg wrote one of the meanest obituaries you can imagine about Kandinsky. This is in 1941, I guess, where he says that Kandinsky was a provincial artist, not an academic artist. And what's wrong with Kandinsky, according to Greenberg? He said there's two kinds of provincial artists. One provincial artist is the one that comes from the backwaters and they're painting in an old-fashioned style that nobody does. Like if somebody now is just doing paintings of churches and things like this, that's provincial in the bad sense. Or one of the bad senses. The other kind of provincial art is when somebody seems to be right in the thick of things, but they're misunderstanding it. And he thinks that's what's Kandinsky's problem. Kandinsky hung out with the Cubists, and he knew what they were up to, and he was in touch with all kinds of advanced art, even though he was from Russia, which was very remote at the time. He was spending all his time in Germany and sometimes in France. And so he was very well aware of what was going on in European art back at the time when European art was where you had to be, where all the action was happening. But he says Kandinsky misunderstood Cubism. Cubism, for Greenberg, is about the flat canvas. It's about creating art that doesn't try to be three-dimensional, that is completely flat, that breaks a three-dimensional object down into flat surfaces on one canvas. Kandinsky misunderstood this as abstraction. Kandinsky thought the point of Cubism was abstraction, like shapes that do not resemble everyday objects. And so Kandinsky does all these color splotches and lines and circles and things. You've seen Kandinsky. And he says, first of all, Greenberg says this is a misunderstanding of what Cubism was about. And second of all, he says it relapses into academic painting. It relapses into this three-dimensional illusionism because Kandinsky's shapes seem to float over this void. And so you think there's this empty space behind them. And what was great about Cubism for Greenberg is that it flattened, it covered the whole canvas. There's not really empty spaces there that aren't accounted for. Everything in the Cubist canvas is accounted for. They have problems with corners, Greenberg admits, because how do you finish off those corners in a Cubist painting? But they did a pretty good job of flattening objects. It's the flattest art we've seen since Byzantine times. The Italians were never this flat. This is how they became famous, by escaping the flatness of the Byzantine icons. Anyway, the point being that Greenberg, since he talks about flatness in art, might seem like the very opposite of a theorist of depth. The way I've said that McLuhan and Heidegger are theorists of depth. They think that what's deeper is more important than what's on the surface. Greenberg might seem to be the opposite, since he talks about flatness, but I disagree. I think Greenberg is also a theorist of depth, because for him what's important is the medium, and the medium happens to be flat in a physical sense. But the content of the painting for Greenberg needs in some way to refer to the medium. You can't be trying to paint illusions of elves and trees and things like lakes. You have to be winking at the audience and saying, yes, I know I'm painting on canvas, canvas is flat, so I'm just going to do abstract shapes and go up the canvas like Picasso and Braque did in the early Cubist period. So, in a sense, I see Greenberg, McLuhan, and Heidegger as fighting the same battle. They're all trying to talk about depth. Depth is what's important. For Heidegger, this is so important that the fate of Western civilization hangs on this, right? Because for Heidegger, what happens when you turn everything into surface, when you turn everything into a calculable stockpile, you turn it's technology for Heidegger. Technology is what reduces everything to a calculable thing whose properties can be exhaustively known, and then we're going to end up with cybernetics, we're going to end up with situations I've been following on YouTube the past few weeks, like robocallers who sound really human, or androids who look real, who move their lips and talk. You're going to reduce things to their appearance, you're going to reduce things to their properties. And this, for Heidegger, is the ultimate negative. For McLuhan, it's the ultimate negative, because if you're stupid enough to focus on the content of a TV show instead of the television medium itself, you're missing the point. And for Greenberg, if you just paint pretty pictures without being aware of what medium you're working in, you're just an academic painter, you're a Sunday painter. You're not to be taken seriously as an artist. You're provincial at best. So, first I want to put that on one side and say these are three very important theorists in three different areas in the 20th century who all are making a closely related point. Today in continental philosophy we have a somewhat opposite phenomenon. We have immanence is very much in fashion. Immanence is the key word that everybody's talking about. So you've got this in Deleuze and Simon Bon, you've got this in, he doesn't think he's hiding behind the world. You've got Badiou, who thinks things can be known directly, there's no hidden in itself. His student Quentin Meillassoux, my colleague in speculative realism, says the same thing. And he also thinks you can exhaustively know the eternal absolute features of things using mathematics. He even does this for arts. He wrote a book about Mallarmé's poem, Un coup de dé. And he says this poem essentially reduces to the number 707 as the secret code governing the poem. And it's a brilliant reading if you read this. I'm convinced that Mallarmé had 707 in mind Count lines that there's 707 words, and there's puns on the name for 7 and 0 in French. But how are you going to do this for all arts? How are you going to explain all artworks mathematically, or all history mathematically, or all? I think it's a fool's errand. I don't think he's going to succeed in this, brilliant though he is. I think this is one of the problems with the heavy mathematization of philosophy that you get from Badiou and Meillassoux. Zizek also. Zizek thinks there's nothing hiding behind the curtain. Everything is on top of the curtain. Everything's a surface. In fact, Zizek has spent his whole career attacking what he calls ideology. And ideology for him means realism. It means believing that there's something hidden behind the what's given. What is Zizek's criticism of anti-Semitism, for example? It's believing that anything or any people can have an essence that is not enacted in some particular set of circumstances. He thinks as soon as you think that there's an essence of something behind its appearance, you're guilty of ideology, you're guilty of something sinister. You're not realizing that the human subject has the freedom to project the world however it wants, and this is what good politics comes from. Good politics for him meaning Stalinism, of course. That was a joke. You've also got Laruelle, who's starting to become one of the prominent new French philosophers. I think he writes too poorly ever to reach that status personally. His writing is impenetrable. He makes Derrida look like a laundry list or something. It's so hard to read Laruelle. Laruelle is also a philosopher of immanence. Laruelle tells us the truth of philosophy, that there's a one, everything is one, and we know it. So don't waste your time with the philosophers. It's a slight exaggeration, but it's basically what he says. Hegel called Schelling's philosophy the night in which all cows are black. I call Laruelle's the daylight in which all cows are black. Everything's one. I don't think you can do much with that. All right, so on the one hand, I oppose this. I oppose this move towards immanence in continental philosophy in recent years. I agree with what these theorists of depth tell us, Heidegger, McLuhan, and Grieber. However, there's a problem with all these theories. All three of them have the same problem, which is the problem is if the depth were all that was important, nothing could ever happen. Nothing would ever change. Nothing would ever move. Consider Heidegger, for example. Being hides behind any specific beings that we see. And by the way, Heidegger, we can't really do anything about it. We just have to wait for being to send us a new historical era. There's nothing we can do about it. But that's impossible. Even Heidegger admits being needs us. Being needs us because without us, it will just be being. It won't come to presence in specific ways. That's one problem Heidegger has. Another problem he has, that I haven't persuaded anyone else of this yet, but Heidegger cannot explain causation. Because if objects withdraw from each other completely, they can never make contact of any sorts. And you have a problem of how things touch. This problem we have in the history of philosophy called occasionalism, where things cannot make each other, cannot affect each other, so God must be intervening every second and making everything happen, which you usually only see in very, very conservative, originally Islamic circles and later Catholic circles in France in the 17th century, saying that God is coming in and doing everything, picking up this pen for me, I'm not actually picking it up, God is picking it up. All right, there has to be some kind of indirect causation, even if it's not God's. There has to be some mediator that makes the causation happen in Heidegger, because for Heidegger, if objects always withdraw from each other and cannot touch, then there's a problem. There's a problem with why things happen. Why does anything happen? So those are reasons why Heidegger needs the surface. He needs the surface as the place where causation happens. Because if things are so deep, they're deeper than any of their impacts or effects. Those impacts and effects, they're the surface. You have to account for that, the theory of the surface there. You need phenomenology, in other words. You need the phenomenon is the place where things happen. Nothing actually happens in those wonderful, dark, deep depths that Heidegger celebrates. What about McLuhan? It's an even clearer case. Because notice there are only two ways for McLuhan the media can change. It's these ways. He calls these the morphology of media, because they determine the structure of media. He calls these the metamorphosis of media, because they deal with how media change. Every medium enhances something, obsolesces something, and it would stay that way, has an inertia. It would keep doing that forever if left to itself. If you buy a car, and the car is fast, and the car is always going to be fast, and it's always going to be faster to drive to work than to walk to work, you're never going to want your horse and buggy again unless things change, unless the circumstances change. How could the circumstances change? What would make you want to give up your car and go to something else? First this, overheating. What happens if there get to be so many cars? I should have mentioned Cairo as an even better example. I lived in Cairo for 13 and a half years. I never considered buying a car. It was not really ridiculous. Why not? Because the traffic jams are the worst ever, worst I've seen in my life by far. If you get in, there are like 4 traffic lights in all of Cairo, so you have to always keep an eye out. You can't rely on the traffic signals. If you get in an accident with somebody, you can't call the police because the police will impound the vehicles until the trial is over, and that'll take 4 years. So you have to negotiate with the other person you hit, and just all the series of nightmares. I would never want cars there. But let's imagine a normal situation. You're in a normal city, you have cars. Why would you give it up? You give it up because it got to the point where traffic congestion was so bad and maybe the city built a rapid transit train to replace it. So you'd say, I'm going to start riding the train from now on. This is overheating. It's overheating because the number of cars has increased, and once the number of anything reaches a certain critical mass, it flips into its opposite. That's one of McLuhan's central theses. That's reversal of the overheated medium. And notice that the car overheats not for any essential reasons. It's not the carness of the car that overheats. The car remains the car. The car remains a fast vehicle that goes at a certain speed and needs a certain amount of gas. The car overheats because of trivial features, seemingly trivial features, such as the fact that it has a metallic bulk that fills up a certain spot on the roads. That's not so important to you at first. That's a kind of accidental feature of the car. You're just trying to get from point A to point B. But if there's 10 million of these in one city, then it becomes important. Then the bulk starts to crowd out the other bulk, and the car is no longer efficient. So these are some of the ways in which media overheats, and they flip into their opposites. And this implies that McLuhan has a nonlinear conception of history. Right? That you cannot extrapolate historically to see where history is going next, because history is always moving in flips. You look at any trend in the recent history, you probably think it's going to get more and more that way, right? It might not. Things might flip into their opposite. You think that, I don't know if this is true or not, but here's an example I read. I heard a horrific lecture about global warming from James Lovelock in Dublin in 2009. He's basically saying we're all doomed, forget it, it's too late, don't even bother trying to stop it, there's only going to be 1 billion of us left in 100 years, all of us are going to be at the North Pole or New Zealand or Ireland, and we have to shoot other people to try to keep the population down and so on. So I was, of course, incredibly depressed by this lecture. And then my friend Graham Wood, who was a reporter for The Atlantic, did a fascinating piece. I don't know if this is true, is that the problem might be the opposite. The problem is it might be too easy to control global warming. And he had experts talk about 6 ways. One of the ways is that you can get a big blimp and pump out sulfur dioxide gas, which is what comes out of volcanoes. And when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in 1986, it reversed global warming for, I think, 3 years or something, just one volcano. And you could actually, according to this one scientist, you could take a blimp and just pump out sulfur dioxide around the clock, and it would reverse global warming. However, it would give us all skin cancer because it would destroy the ozone layer. So there's a big side effect there. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you're Bangladesh or if you're the Netherlands, it might be worth it. And you can do this for $5 billion, I think. That's well within their budgets for those countries. And you can, one of these countries might say, in our own best interest, we're going to start reversing global warming by pumping out this gas. But it's not in the best interest of Australia, where skin cancer is 3 times higher than it is anywhere in the world. We were just there. You have to wear sunscreen even on a dark day, otherwise you get skin cancer. So that's just one example of how sometimes things reverse all of a sudden without our expecting it. The other kind is retrieval. This is perhaps even more interesting. For McLuhan, when a medium dies out, it becomes cliche, it becomes boring. No one wants anything to do with it. It's junk. One of his favorite sayings is the most boring thing in the world is last week's newspaper. But then, of course, last week's newspaper becomes very interesting in 10 years, right, or in 20 years. It becomes historical material. And this is what happens with dead media. They become very boring. People throw them out. And then suddenly they become fascinating again. And the retrieval for him is what happens when a dead cliche becomes fascinating again. And he says this is what artists do. He means artists in the broadest sense. Artists bring back something that seemed to be dead, and they make it alive again. So you could say the Romantics brought back the medieval times again. And during the period of Enlightenment and rationalism, the Middle Ages were seen as the Dark Ages. No one wanted anything to do with them. And suddenly they're back in fashion. Suddenly they're back in fashion, the Romantics. They make an art form out of Sir Walter Scott and the Knights of the Round Table and all of this. I was just reading about Ottoman history. That, for a long time, Western historians weren't interested in Ottoman history. The Ottomans were the sick man of Europe and so forth. And then now the Ottomans are very much back in fashion. They're very interested in the bureaucratic efficiency of the Ottomans, how they were able to control such a huge territory. So when something goes into neglect for a long time, it can suddenly become fertile ground to become very interesting again. And there are countless examples of this. And this is another reason why McLuhan has a nonlinear interpretation of history. Anything can come back. Don't ever think anything's gone forever. We thought slavery was gone, and now slavery is back bigger than ever. We thought that there was some other horrible things that had come back. The Black Plague could come back. The death rate is almost as high now as it was in the Middle Ages. All kinds of things that we thought belonged to past history could come back anytime. We had, during the Egyptian Revolution, we had the Battle of the Camel, where those camels came in and it was absurd. It was kind of something back in the medieval past, but it came back and it played a key role in the Egyptian Revolution. So the point I want to make here is that this is also a matter of the surface. It's the artists who encounter all these cliches, and artists in the broadest sense. It could be any design person, any creative person, can see something that used to be dead, and they bring it back, but they bring it back in an interesting, creative way that works. You can't just bring back the old architecture. We've got postmodern architecture, which takes old motifs and tries to bring them back, if successful, in at least somewhat plausible way. We have a postmodern Islamic campus at the American University of Cairo. I happen to think it's quite beautiful. Some of my modernist architect friends loathe it. I think it's quite pretty, and it looks kind of like medieval Cordoba or one of these Andalusian cities. But they didn't just take those buildings and transplant them. They have to adapt them in a way, handicapped accessible and things, and certain other stylistic things that we need now. This is a kind of retrieval, if you agree with me that it was successful in that case. I think it was very successful. They retrieved successfully Andalusian architecture of the early Middle Ages. All right, these both happen at the surface. The medium itself does nothing. The medium itself just sits there. Why would a medium ever change? The medium changes because it overheats, or because somebody finds a way to bring back a competitor medium that seemed to be dead. Remember when mainframe computers seemed to be dead when I was a kid, everyone was going to PCs? And then mainframes came back, right? Because now we have the internet, we have cloud computing now. It's like the mainframe. It's like a new version of the mainframe. The PC doesn't store all the information anymore. You put it all up in the clouds. There's countless examples of this in history. Things seem to be gone and then they come back. So that's the way in which McLuhan is actually a theorist of the surface, in the same way that Heidegger is. What about Greenberg? Well, there's a couple of problems with Greenberg. His theory that painting has to be about the attention to the flat canvas. One of those is that Greenberg has almost nothing to tell us about pre-Manet painting, pre-modern painting, as it were. Because obviously there was this great history of painting from the Italian, even earlier, even just in modern times, the Italian Renaissance up through the 1840s, let's say. A lot of developments were going on aesthetically, and you cannot explain them in terms of greater attention to the flat canvas medium. That's a late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon. That's something Greenberg and his favorite artists were concerned about. So what is it exactly that's guiding the development through Leonardo and Raphael and on with the Spaniards and all these different painters in the West? It can't be Greenberg's theory. Greenberg's theory can only work at best for the 20th century avant-gardes. When you look backwards. When you look forwards, the same thing. Because how much can you flatten the painting? Once you get to Pollock, how can you get it any flatter than that? Well, there are a few people who try. So you can do what Nolan paints those paintings that look like targets, color field painting, where you just have basically zones of color on the canvas. That's getting even flatter maybe. But then where do you go after that? And I think this is probably why the kind of modernism that Greenberg supported died out. There just wasn't any more you could do with that sort of art. And so it took a turn in the direction of pop, in the direction of performance, in the direction of minimalism, other avenues people try to explore that Greenberg disapproved of. But I happen to also think content will probably make a comeback in the arts. Content is a way of some of the most moving art of our times is figural arts. You would have thought that was dead. I'm thinking of the graffiti in Tahrir Square in Cairo. It's some of the most beautiful art I've seen in my lifetime. These kind of haunting images of weird mix, pharaonic mythological creatures, plus Hosni Mubarak, plus soldiers, plus protesters, plus Muslim Brotherhood figures, all these things mixed together in one ever-changing mural on our university wall, that our university is allowed to stay there in Tahrir. It's changing constantly. This is figural art. It's not high modernism of the kind that Greenberg would have approved of. And I don't think it's just because it's political. Even if you take the politics out of it, it's very moving on a purely aesthetic level. Even if you didn't care at all about what's happening in Egypt, it's very moving to see these disembodied figures floating around in empty mural space. So I think looking backwards and looking forwards, Greenberg's theory of the flat canvas has a harder time explaining everything. So there has to be a surface, but it cannot be the old academic surface. The surface must be a kind that triggers a depth in all of these things. The kind of painting, you can't just go back and paint old-fashioned figural oil painting. It will look kitsch if you do that. There has to be kind of an edge to it somehow. There has to be, Lucien Ford, look at Lucien Ford. Okay, he does portrait painting, but they're not just straight out portraits. There's something a little grotesque about them. He puts a little twist on it. Grisha Bruskin, who's a not so well-known contemporary artist, is one of my favorite, a Russian who lives in New York, paints all these creatures in what looks like hieroglyphic style, mythological creatures that are laid out like hieroglyphics. It's quite fascinating. And it's quite surprising. He paints a fake alphabet behind it that doesn't refer to any known language. So it's got the form of a language, but it's not really a language. So if anyone's going to do this kind of seemingly throwback figural arts, it has to have a kind of twist to it. And there is a great example for this in art history, and that is Cézanne. Because what was Cézanne trying to do? According to Greenberg, and I agree with this interpretation, Cézanne was trying to recover something of three-dimensional art from what the Impressionists had done. The Impressionists had already started flattening things out by just putting all the color there on the surface. Everything was kind of murky and shimmery. Cézanne was trying to bring back an illusion of solid bulk and depth again. His paintings look three-dimensional in a way that the Impressionist paintings don't, but he's still using the Impressionist techniques. They're all wavy and fluttery. So Cézanne becomes a key figure. Somebody who's trying to retrieve something that seemed dead. He's trying to retrieve something from classical art without relapsing into copying classical art. All right, how are we doing on time? I think we're past, so I'll just wrap up here and say that I think that probably the future in these disciplines will have something to do with involvements. Speaking specifically of the visual arts here, the visual arts isn't just going to be about formal techniques, but it's going to have to be about something that involves the spectator. And this is what McLuhan describes as tribalization, following the electronic media. We're all involved, we're all, in a sense, paranoid. We're all a corporate body experiencing things together through the mass media. We're not literate, isolated monks living in cells, reading books by ourselves, as used to be the case with intellectuals. And we probably had an early taste of this sort of thing with political fascism, a bad taste of it. But we're now getting probably the liberal democratic version of it, where people are becoming involved, but they're becoming involved privately. They're becoming involved in their little cocoon of iPods, and you never meet a person wearing an iPod who can function normally. They're always walking up too fast behind you, or they're making too much noise, or it's kind of disturbing sometimes to be in the same space as somebody wearing an iPod, because they bump into you too often. They're cutting themselves off from the shared space, but they're creating this kind of personal cocoon-like involvement. Video games, we've already talked about. My colleague Ian Bogost, who's a famous video game critic, says, as some people also say, that video games will be the 21st century what film was the 20th. The great popular art form becomes a high art form at some point. I don't think we've seen that yet, have we? High art video game. I don't play enough video games to know. We're still kind of at the shoot and kill phase of video games, but eventually there might be a high art genre of video games. And this would just have a connection with what McLuhan talks about as the privilege of rhetoric over dialectic, or what Heidegger talks about as the dominance of being over beings. The fact that what's lying behind the curtain is often more important than what's on the surface, although I've suggested reasons why that might have to reverse, why we can't go too far in that direction. There are theoretical drawbacks that go when we push too far in that direction. Let me just I already complained about Dennett's views on wine criticism. I'll say what I think is positive about the other kind of wine criticism. What's positive about things like wine criticism, food criticism, theater criticism, literary criticism, art criticism, architecture criticism. Normally when we think of criticism, we think of tearing things down, reducing things to some, for example, Marxist criticism. You claim that this play is about such and such, but it's actually about bourgeois class interests. You're tearing the play down to some economic substrate. And that's the kind of critique we're used to. You're debunking. You're telling somebody they're merely superstitious, or they're stupid, or naive, and you're going to tell them the truth that's underlying everything. There's another kind of critique, though, the kinds I've just mentioned, art critique and food critique, where you precisely can add to that. Restaurant criticism is not about typing the recipes that we used. Restaurant criticism is about trying to capture the mood of the restaurants and the feel of the individual dishes. Wine criticism, even at its most pretentious, is about trying to capture the exact undertones of tobacco or rose in every vintage. And this is perhaps the kind of critique that we ought to see more of in intellectual life. This sort of more sensitive critique that is aware that there's a background to the things that cannot be translated into some explicit propositional form. And this is why I think geometry and the natural sciences are not a good model for philosophy. The last 400 years since Descartes, and especially perhaps in Anglo-American analytic philosophy, we've seen natural sciences especially taken as a model for philosophy. And one problem with this is that the natural sciences are under pressure, to paraphrase things, the natural sciences are under pressure to say electrons means the following 45 qualities, or however many 50 that we haven't discovered yet, so maybe it's 8. However many qualities are there. This is what you do when you're a good scientist. You figure out the qualities of a thing. This is not what good artists do. Artists do not paraphrase an artwork in terms of look at government and analyze exactly what that means, what the agencies are that combine to form the Turkish government, who the people are. Don't start with some big fuzzy abstraction. Look locally at what is actually going on. And this allows him methodologically to do wonderful things. Like he's able to read philosophy papers like, how is the price of apricots determined in Paris? He came and gave that lecture in Cairo. My colleagues were sure it was not philosophy, but I thought it was. He was showing the process by which apricot prices are determined in Paris every day. What's the weakness of Latour's theory? I was asked this when I was lecturing in London once. I think Latour defines things as being equivalent to their effects or their actions. There is nothing more to a thing than what it does. A thing is what it does. And one of the problems with this is that it does not allow you to handle counterfactual cases very well, which are very important in the humanities just as they are in natural science experiments. For example, he wrote this wonderful study of Pasteur, Louis Pasteur. It's called, in English, The Pasteurization of France. In French, it's called The War and Peace of Microbes. It's a brilliant book. And what he does is he says, okay, what do people think when they hear Louis Pasteur? They think great, giant genius who brought light to the darkness. Before him, everybody thought that germs could grow spontaneously in a beaker, and he showed that they couldn't, and he saved all these children, too, while he was doing it by vaccines, and all these streets in France are named after him. He's just this hero. You know, some scientists are controversial because they led to the atomic bomb or they led to chemical weapons. There's no controversy about Pasteur. Pasteur is this great, wonderful person who helped humanity, right? But Latour wants to go in and look exactly what Pasteur did, and it turns out to be a lot more interesting than it looks. He didn't just make these correct theories and prove them with experiments, and then everyone agrees and changes their mind. There was a lot of politics involved. Pasteur had to do politics at the time, and it was interesting politics. When Pasteur first demonstrated the role of microbes in disease, it seems that he was actually opposed by doctors, because doctors thought it would reach the point where you could just give everybody a shot for everything and nobody would ever get sick. You wouldn't need doctors anymore, they were going to be out of business. And so doctors were challenging this by saying, oh, but you need some finesse to know what it's like to be a doctor. You can't just put needles in people's arms. It takes a certain wisdom that you pick up. The people who were supporting Pasteur were the hygienists. The hygienists were the people, hygiene was a political movement then. It wasn't taken for granted as it is now. This idea, why are the factory workers getting so sick all the time? And some people would say just because they're wretched. The poor are wretched and inferior. This is why they're getting sick all the time. Hygienists would say, no, they seem to be getting sick because of some causal reasons. Like, they didn't know why, but they made lists of hundreds of features. You know, it seems like it's a bad idea to live next door to manure piles. It seems like flies are bad for health. And it seems like drinking dirty water is bad for you. And it seems like you ought to wash your clothes a couple of times a month. And you know, this whole list of things that they couldn't connect. And Pasteur gave them a way to connect all those things. It's germs. And so, of course, they all rallied to his defense quickly. And the doctors were against him at first. And then he got the doctors on board. How did he do that? By inventing the serum for rabies, so that you could actually give the rabies shots after the bites in the doctor's office. And then he was able to politically cajole the doctors in. So he's able to do this. And, of course, he's criticized for reducing science to power politics, and there's some truth in that. You know, Latour says some extreme things. So he says that Ramses II couldn't have died of tuberculosis because it hadn't been discovered yet, so that's an anachronism. So he gets a little extreme like that, and you know, that the so-called hoax targeted him in part for this reason 17 years ago. So sometimes he goes too far for my taste, but he's good at showing how all these actors work and make history more interesting than we thought. Science is not just the triumph of reason over unreason. It's a little more complicated than that. But he's very bad at, I wouldn't say very bad, he doesn't try. He doesn't try to talk about other possible scenarios, other possible Pasteur histories. What might Pasteur have done? What might have happened differently? How might have things played out differently? Latour's very bad at handling this because for him it makes no sense to say how might Pasteur have had a different life, because Pasteur is nothing other than his actions. And so you can look retroactively and say, what did Pasteur do and how did he succeed? But you cannot extract Pasteur from his context and ask, how might it have worked if he had been in this situation or this situation or this situation? And of course, the natural sciences do this very effectively. And granted, you can't do experiments in history the way you can do them in the natural sciences. In the natural sciences, you can repeat things as much as you want. History, obviously, you cannot ever repeat anything. You can look for comparable cases in some areas. But counterfactual history has become more popular. It is criticized still. It's criticized for the wrong reasons, though, I think. People say that counterfactual history is bad because it resurrects this romantic great man theory of history where it's all about Napoleon and his decisions and what Napoleon had invaded here. It doesn't have to be that, though. You can do counterfactual history about whole nations or whole economies, I think. Like, you know, what if the U.S. had not abolished slavery until the 1880s? How would things look? You can do things like that historically, and it makes sense. You're never going to have an exactly accurate result the way you would in a scientific experiment, but you can ask interesting questions this way. So that's one of the things you can do. You can do counterfactual arguments. You can, in the arts, I think, well, actually, let me talk about architecture for a second. There might be some architects here. I've been invited a lot to architecture schools lately, and I'm still not quite sure why. It's fun. I learn a lot from them. I'm not quite sure what they're doing with my theories yet. One of the things seems to be there's a reaction against the kind of Deleuzianism that was rampant in architecture for a generation, where everything's about continuous gradients and everything's a continuum, and there's no clear cutoff between the building and the surrounding areas and things of this sort. And some of this lives on now in Patrick Schumacher, who's the chief lieutenant of Zaha Hadid's firm in London, and he's written this giant 2-volume manifesto on architecture. And one of the things he says in there is that everything should be continuous, there should not be any abrupt jumps, all curves should be like this. What some of the object-oriented people seem to be doing in architecture, and they're still small in number, is trying to question that, trying to talk about the building as something that is radically decontextualized, and the building is something that has discrete zones. Because this kind of architecture, for example, admits that it cannot handle doorways and windows very well. Because if everything's supposed to be continuous, how do you arbitrarily decide, okay, here's going to be a window? You're breaking up this wonderful continuum when you do that. And so you're going to have a hard time handling apertures, as Schumacher admits. And every kind of architecture, like every kind of philosophy, will have its downside. But if you use an object-oriented method, you can talk about things as distinct from their contexts in a way that might be useful. Whereas there's a tendency to over-contextualize now, I think, especially in sociology, anthropology, some other fields. This is what postmodernism is about. It's what everything's, well, you can read it two ways. You can read it as being everything's outside, withdrawals from the context, but not quite, because everything's still the surface for postmodernism. There's nothing deep and hidden for postmodernism. Everything is somehow on the surface. It just is involved in different contexts at different times. Whereas this object-oriented philosophy is trying to talk about something that is real, but that is never fully expressed in any particular form in which it's encountered. This does involve a certain sacrifice in the problem, which is how can we ever know the thing? Immanuel Kant's introduced the things in themselves into philosophy. Things in themselves can be thought and not known. We are trapped in the human 12 categories of understanding in time and space, and we cannot know whether the real world has the 12 categories or has time and space. We are trapped in a human framework, and so we can never know the way things really are. This is sometimes criticized as meaningless because you can't say anything about anything anymore. Everything's just negative theology. You can just say what things are not. I say that's not true. I say that there's another way of talking which is neither negative nor positive. It's indirect. And this is what, indeed, most language is. That's why I said something against paraphrase. Most intellectual life involves paraphrase. It involves reducing objects either upward or downward. Either it involves reducing things to their particles or their components, or it involves reducing things upward to the effects they have on us, or how they present themselves in language, or how power configures them in society. What those methods do not do well enough is capture the object which is in between those two extremes, which is neither reducible to its pieces, because it's something more than those pieces, nor reducible to the effect it has on us or anything else, because it's something deeper than those. It's a surplus deeper than those. So it's an indirect method. And the critique of this could be that it's all just poetry, arbitrary poetry, then, but I don't think it is. I think metaphor is a cognitive tool. We know this. Metaphor is an indirect way of describing things. And all human inquiry uses metaphor and uses other forms of indirect language. I don't know who's next. Who's calling in hands? I better not do it. Conflict of interest.
I would like to know a little bit more whether in some ways you're talking about a return of phenomenology or a return to phenomenology in the sense that, of course, there's been a lot of recent interest in a revival of talking about Merleau-Ponty in particular, speaking of Cézanne. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about, is there a connection between phenomenology and, or could there be a media-oriented phenomenology?
Quite possibly. I should say that I came out of phenomenology, and so I have the greatest respect for it. Most of the speculative realists hate phenomenology. I'm the only one who doesn't. We all hate each other's favorite philosophers, even though we work together closely. The only writer we all like is H.P. Lovecraft, the horror writer. We don't have any of the same hero philosophers. I'm the only one who likes phenomenology. Meillassoux and those guys can't stand it. All right, what I like about phenomenology, though, is probably not quite the same thing that people are taking from Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty has been, I think, very fertile in philosophy of mind, a number of authors. My problem with him, he's a fantastic writer. He talks about the flesh, this intertwining of human and the world. But why is it always human in the world? Why does the human always have to be there on the scene? This, to me, he's still stuck in Kantianism. The human is always there as half of any philosophical situation. Merleau-Ponty doesn't really tell us anything about stone colliding with stone or fire burning cotton. Now, granted, philosophers have stopped believing they have anything to say about that. We've gotten so used to saying, let the sciences talk about that. We have nothing to say about fires, burning things. In a way, we don't. We can't compete with the sciences on that terrain. But we at least have to have a theory general enough that it can account for all relations, I think. So Merleau-Ponty, he's wonderful to read. In a sense, he's not one of my favorites, though. But what I really love about phenomenology, I don't love the idealism of it. I do think phenomenology is ultimately an idealist movement. People will say that's not true. People will say, well, in phenomenology, we're always already outside of our mind, being conscious of something. That's not really being outside of your mind. They could all be hallucinations still. For me, what's interesting in Husserl is I see him as a very powerful critic of Hume, in the sense of the Hume of the bundle of qualities. For all of British empiricism, of course, there aren't really objects. They're bundles of qualities, and we are the ones who paste these things together and arbitrarily think that they're objects. You know, I see red, sweet, hard, juicy, spherical, and I think it's an apple. But nobody ever saw an apple. I just saw these qualities. Husserl reverses that. Husserl says, no, I experienced the apple first. And then I see the qualities as qualities of the apple. And he gives a sort of proof of this. He says, you know, if I turn the apple in my hand and see it from different angles, I'm not saying, okay, this apple is 99.7%, or these qualities are 99.7% similar to what I saw 1 microsecond ago. Therefore, I will determine that there are enough family resemblances that it's the same thing. That's not what happens in your mind. What happens in your mind is you say it's the same apple seen from a different angle. He talks about his friend Hans in the logical investigations. You see your friend Hans walking down the street. Yesterday he had different clothes, he was in a different mood. You saw him at a closer distance perhaps. You're not going to say, well, this guy is very similar to the one I called Hans yesterday, so I will arbitrarily call this guy Hans. No, it's the same Hans, seen from different perspectives. So it's the object that comes first. So what's interesting about Husserl is he creates a tension within the experiential realm, within the empirical realm, that I don't think was ever there before. I can't think. There are parts of Kant where he seems to get close to this, but he doesn't quite do it. I think Husserl may be the first philosopher that said that even if you flatten it out and deal with everything as phenomenal, there's a big tension there going on. You have to figure out how one object can have so many adumbrations that are hiding its essence. The essence is there, and you have to strip away all the accidents to get the essence. It's kind of like, you know, Aristotle, of course, had the famous distinction between substance and accidents, but that was about real things. Husserl, in a sense, is doing that at the level of experience. There's a difference between substance and accidents within experiences, rather than in the real world. I find that endlessly fascinating, and so few, if any, Husserl commentators have come across this because they're so busy defending Husserl and saying he's not an idealist, which I think is a lost cause. You might as well just embrace the fact that he is and say that he still has a lot to teach us.